My grandfather was a long-haul truck driver, spending weeks at a time on the road, traversing the vast stretches of the American landscape. He had countless stories from his travels, some funny, some mundane, but a few were genuinely unsettling, tales he would only share in hushed tones around a crackling campfire. One story in particular always stuck with me, a chilling account of a strange experience he had on a lonely stretch of highway in Nevada. It was a late night in the early 1970s, he told me, and he was hauling a load of cargo across the desolate Nevada desert. The highway was empty, stretching out before him like a black ribbon under the vast, star-studded sky. The only sound was the rumble of his truck's engine and the static crackling on his CB radio. He was trying to reach another trucker a few miles ahead, hoping for some company on the long, lonely drive. But all he got was static, a constant hiss and crackle that filled the cab of his truck. He tried adjusting the frequency, but nothing changed. The static persisted, a constant, irritating noise that grated on his nerves. Then, through the static, he heard a voice. It was faint, barely audible, but it was definitely a human voice, a woman's voice speaking in a low, monotone whisper. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unsettling, filled with a sense of sadness and despair. He tried to tune the radio again, thinking he had accidentally picked up a distant station, but the voice remained, intertwined with the static, a constant, haunting whisper. He tried to ignore it, focusing on the road ahead, but the voice was persistent, drawing him in, filling him with a growing sense of unease. Then, the voice changed. It became clearer, louder, as if the woman was speaking directly into his radio. He could now make out some of the words, fragments of sentences, disjointed and unsettling. Lost, alone, can't find my way. A chill ran down his spine. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He knew with a certainty that defied logic that this was not a radio broadcast. This was something else, something strange and inexplicable. He tried to contact the district office on his radio, but the static was so intense that he couldn't get a clear signal. He was completely alone, isolated in the cab of his truck, with only the whispering voice for company. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the voice stopped. The static cleared, and he was able to contact the other trucker ahead. He told him about what he had heard, but the other trucker dismissed it as a radio malfunction, a trick of the atmosphere. But my grandfather knew better. He never forgot the whispering voice, the chilling words, the overwhelming sense of dread that had filled him that night. He told me that he had driven that stretch of highway many times since, but he had never heard anything like that again. He always suspected that the voice belonged to someone who had been lost on that lonely highway, someone who was still searching for their way home. It was a story that always gave me chills, a reminder of the strange and unexplained phenomena that can occur in the most desolate and lonely places. It was a late autumn night, and I was driving back home after visiting my family a few hours north. The coastal highway was usually a scenic drive, hugging the cliffs overlooking the Pacific Ocean, but tonight, a thick fog had rolled in, blanketing the road and reducing visibility to near zero. I drove slowly and cautiously, my headlights cutting through the dense fog like two weak beams in a white void. The only sounds were the hum of my engine, the soft whoosh of my tires on the wet pavement, and the distant mournful foghorns echoing from the coast. As I rounded a sharp bend in the road, I saw something in the distance. A faint light, barely visible through the fog, seemed to be moving along the side of the road. I slowed down even further, trying to make out what it was. As I got closer, I realized it was a figure, walking along the shoulder of the highway. The figure was tall and slender, shrouded in the fog, making it difficult to see any details. It seemed to be wearing a long coat or cloak, and its head was bowed, as if it were looking down at the ground. I felt a shiver run down my spine. There was something unsettling about the figure, something that made me feel deeply uneasy. I couldn't explain it, but I had a strong feeling that something was wrong. I slowed down to a crawl as I approached the figure, intending to offer them a ride. As I got closer, I could see that the figure was not walking. but gliding, moving effortlessly along the shoulder of the highway, as if it were floating just above the ground. My heart pounded in my chest. I felt a surge of fear, a primal instinct telling me to stay away. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to continue driving, not wanting to stop on such a desolate stretch of road in such thick fog. As I passed the figure, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The figure had stopped moving and was now facing my car. I could still only make out a vague outline through the fog, but I could feel its gaze fixed on me. I accelerated quickly, not wanting to look back again. I drove as fast as I dared in the fog, my eyes glued to the road ahead, my heart still pounding. After a few miles, the fog began to thin, and I could finally see the road ahead clearly. I glanced in my rearview mirror again, but the figure was gone. There was no sign of it on the highway, no indication that anyone had been there. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands shaking. I needed to catch my breath, to calm my nerves. I couldn't explain what I had seen. The figure's gliding movement, its silent presence in the fog, the overwhelming sense of dread it had evoked. It was all too strange, too unsettling. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to compose myself. Then, I continued my drive home. The image of the figure in the fog burned into my memory. I've driven that stretch of highway many times since, but I've never seen anything like that again. The experience left me with a lingering sense of unease, a reminder of the strange and unexplained things that can happen on lonely roads in the dead of night. My friends and I were avid urban explorers, always searching for abandoned places to explore and document. We'd heard rumors of an abandoned mine shaft deep in the forests of Northern California, a relic of the gold rush era, said to be sealed off after a tragic accident. The rumors also spoke of strange occurrences within the mine, whispers and unexplained lights, fueling our curiosity. One crisp autumn weekend, we decided to embark on an expedition to find the mine. We drove for hours, following old logging roads and overgrown trails, until we reached a remote area deep within the forest. According to our research, the mine was located near a secluded clearing, marked by a cluster of old, decaying mining equipment. After several hours of searching, we finally stumbled upon the clearing. The rusted remains of a headframe, a large wooden structure used to lower miners into the shaft, stood silhouetted against the fading light. Scattered around the clearing were other pieces of abandoned machinery, overgrown with weeds and vines. The mine shaft itself was sealed off by a heavy wooden door, reinforced with iron bars. The door was old and weathered, but it was clear that someone had made an effort to keep it closed. We found a small opening near the bottom of the door, just large enough for one person to squeeze through. We decided to enter. I went first, squeezing through the narrow opening and into the darkness of the mine shaft. The air inside was cold and damp, and the smell of damp earth and decaying wood filled my nostrils. I turned on my flashlight, illuminating the narrow tunnel that stretched into the darkness. The tunnel sloped downwards, leading us deeper into the earth. The only sound was the dripping of water and the echo of our footsteps. As we ventured further into the mine, we began to hear faint whispers, seemingly coming from the depths of the tunnel. At first, we dismissed them as the wind whistling through the cracks in the rocks, but the whispers grew louder and more distinct as we progressed. They sounded like hushed voices, too faint to understand, but definitely human. We continued deeper, our flashlights illuminating the damp, rocky walls of the tunnel. We found old mining tools scattered along the floor, rusted and broken relics of a bygone era. We also found evidence of the accident that had sealed the mine, a collapsed section of the tunnel, blocked by a pile of rocks and debris. As we stood there examining the collapsed section, the whispers intensified. They seemed to be coming from beyond the blockage, as if someone was trying to communicate with us from the other side. Then we saw a light. It was a faint glow, emanating from the darkness beyond the blockage. It flickered and danced, moving erratically through the darkness. We froze, our hearts pounding in our chests. We shone our flashlights towards the light, but it quickly vanished. The whisper stopped abruptly, leaving us in complete silence. We stood there for a moment, catching our breath, trying to make sense of what we had just seen and heard. The air in the mine felt heavy, charged with an unseen presence. We decided to leave. We didn't speak as we made our way back through the tunnel, the silence broken only by the echo of our footsteps. We squeezed back through the narrow opening and into the fresh air, relieved to be out of the mine. We never went back to the abandoned mine shaft. We couldn't explain the whispers, the light, or the overwhelming sense of unease we felt inside. The experience left us with a chilling reminder of the mysteries that lie hidden in the forgotten corners of the world. My job as a seasonal forest ranger took me to some remote and beautiful places. But one particular assignment stands out in my memory, not for its beauty, but for its sheer, unsettling creepiness. I was stationed at a fire lookout tower, perched atop a remote peak in the Cascade Mountains. The tower was old, built in the 1930s, a simple wooden structure with a small living quarters on top, surrounded by windows offering a 360-degree view of the surrounding wilderness. The location was incredibly isolated. The nearest town was a good 2-hour drive down a winding mountain road, and the only other human contact I had was the occasional radio check-in with the district office. The solitude was initially appealing, a chance to disconnect from the world and immerse myself in nature. My duties were simple: monitor the surrounding forests for signs of fire, report any suspicious activity, and maintain the tower. The days were long and quiet, filled with the sounds of the wind whistling through the trees and the distant calls of birds. The nights, however, were a different story. From the very first night, I felt a sense of unease in the tower. It was a subtle feeling, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, a feeling of being watched. I tried to dismiss it as the natural anxiety of being alone in such a remote location, but the feeling persisted. One night, a dense fog rolled in, blanketing the mountain and obscuring the surrounding landscape. The visibility was reduced to almost zero, and the tower was enveloped in a thick white shroud. The wind howled around the tower, creating an eerie atmosphere. As I sat in the living quarters, listening to the wind and the fog swirling around the tower, I began to hear strange noises. It started with faint creaking sounds, as if the tower itself was shifting and groaning. Then, I heard footsteps on the catwalk that surrounded the living quarters. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I was alone in the tower. There was no one else up there. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously moved to the window, peering out into the fog. I couldn't see anything. The footsteps continued, circling the tower, slow and deliberate. I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I tried to rationalize the sounds, to convince myself that it was just the wind or the old tower settling. But the footsteps were too distinct, too human-like. Then, I heard a voice. It was a low whisper, seemingly coming from just outside the window. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was chilling, filled with a sense of malice. I recoiled from the window, my breath catching in my throat. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I knew with absolute certainty that I was not alone in the tower. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of the living quarters, my flashlight clutched tightly in my hand, listening to the wind, the fog, and the whispers that continued to haunt the night. The next morning, the fog finally lifted, revealing the stunning view of the surrounding forests. But the sense of unease remained. I checked the catwalk for any signs of someone having been there, but there were none. The only footprints were my own. I never experienced anything like that again during my time at the fire lookout. But the memory of that foggy night, the footsteps and the whispers, continues to haunt me. I've heard stories from other rangers about strange occurrences in the older towers, whispers of past tragedies and unexplained phenomena. I can't explain what I experienced that night, but I know it wasn't just the wind. There was something else up there with me, something I couldn't see, but could definitely feel. My love for hiking had taken me to some incredible places, but nothing could have prepared me for what I experienced on Mount Rainier. It was late September, the tail end of the hiking season, and the mountain was quieter than usual. I had decided on a solo overnight trip to a remote backcountry campsite near a glacial lake. The forecast was clear, promising stunning views and crisp autumn air. The hike to the campsite was challenging but rewarding. The trail wound through lush forests, past cascading waterfalls, and up steep slopes, offering breathtaking panoramas of the surrounding wilderness. As I approached the lake, the imposing presence of Mount Rainier loomed large, its snow-capped peak piercing the sky. The campsite was nestled among a grove of ancient pines, overlooking the serene glacial lake. The water was a deep turquoise blue, reflecting the majestic mountain like a mirror. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and cooked a simple dinner as the sun began to set, painting the sky in vibrant hues of orange and purple. As darkness fell, a thick mist began to roll in, obscuring the lake and the surrounding landscape. The temperature dropped sharply, and a damp chill permeated the air. I retreated to my tent, zipped it up tight, and settled into my sleeping bag. The night was eerily quiet. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of crickets, were muted by the thick mist. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the water against the shore. Then, around 2 a.m., I was awakened by a sound that made me sit bolt upright. It was a rhythmic tapping, seemingly coming from just outside my tent. At first, I thought it was a branch tapping against the fabric, but the tapping was too regular, too deliberate. I held my breath, listening intently. The tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. It sounded like someone was knocking on a door, but there was no door on my tent. Fear gripped me. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously unzipped the tent flap. I shone the beam into the mist, but I couldn't see anything. The tapping stopped abruptly. I peered out into the dense fog, straining my eyes to see through the swirling white mass. The air was thick with moisture, and the silence was unnerving. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Suddenly, I saw a flicker of movement in the mist. A shape, vaguely human-like, seemed to materialize out of the fog just a few feet from my tent. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The shape remained motionless, shrouded in the mist. I shone my flashlight on it, but the beam was diffused by the fog, making it difficult to see clearly. I could make out a dark, indistinct form, but no details. Then, the shape began to move. It glided silently through the mist, not walking, but floating, as if it were hovering just above the ground. It moved slowly, deliberately, circling my tent. I watched in terror, unable to move, unable to scream. The tapping started again, this time on the opposite side of my tent, as the shape continued its silent patrol. This went on for what felt like an eternity. The shape circled my tent, the tapping continuing intermittently, the mist swirling around it, obscuring its form. Finally, as the first hint of dawn began to break through the mist, the shape vanished. The tapping stopped, and the fog began to dissipate, revealing the serene beauty of the lake and the majestic mountain. I emerged from my tent, shaken and exhausted. There were no footprints in the soft earth around my tent, no sign of anyone or anything having been there. The only evidence of the night's events was the lingering chill in the air and the lingering fear in my heart. I packed up my camp quickly and hiked back down the mountain, never looking back. I've been hiking many times since, but I've never experienced anything like that night on Mount Rainier. The memory of the tapping, the floating shape in the mist, and the overwhelming sense of dread continues to haunt me, a chilling reminder of the mysteries that lurk in the wilderness.